of friends in the audience. Nice to see all your names. And I believe there's, oh, now here's what I need to do while we're all talking.
I believe we are live on YouTube.
Very cool. Okay, here's a thing that we have, and that is people in the audience who are not visible on the screen. On the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A panel that you can open, and you can ask questions of the various panelists. And we will, John Markoff and I will make a determination midstream as we're going along, whether it's going to be, it's been answered, we're not going to be able to get to it, we want you to do it live, that kind of thing. So feel free to leave us questions, and I'll try as best as I can to monitor the chat while we're going on. But Ted, I'll invite you to text me if you think there's something else I need to know. Okay.
Nancy, I think you probably heard me say we're live on YouTube streaming now. So I'm going to try to post a link on the event page to in case we get over 100 attendees, so that folks can see that as an alternate way to listen to the stream.
Right. Sounds good. We actually did increase our number to 500, but
oh, cool. Well, then
it'll be multiple. You know, we love redundancy, right? We're the Department of Redundancy.
It'll be interesting to see if some folks prefer to watch on YouTube.
I love that, Ralph, you've costumed yourself appropriately. That's really nice to see. Very thoughtful of you.
Well, I'm having a contest with Bill Atkinson for the brightest shirt, and I don't know if he's going to win this one or not.
We might have to take a poll of the audience, see?
But I'll leave it on, don't worry.
Oh, okay. And I don't even have to ask if everybody's wearing pants, right?
No, it's prepared. Are those cookies?
Can't hear you. You're on mute, Bill.
Just some grapes and a chai tea, my favorite beverage.
Okay, very good. And I'm choosing seltzer in the bottle.
Ice water.
I'd rather have a free bottle in front of me than a prefrontal lobotomy.
Oh my goodness. This is the occasion when I'm glad I'm not doing the sign language interpreting for this meeting.
Try to translate that one.
And make it funny. It's got to, right? Okay. The attendees, as it predicted, are interested to know how many attendees there are. So far, we've got 30 people, but the number keeps increasing, and we aren't even at 7:30 yet. Now, we heard, I think many or all of the panelists know, but can the panelists see the participants? No.
I could see the names.
You can see the names. We can see your names in the participant column on the side of our screen, but we can't see you by video, right?
Okay.
And
Where
the
do
other
I see the participants' names? I don't see those.
if you, well, I don't know, maybe, let's see, I'm not looking at the panelist view. When you click on participants on the bottom of the screen, Bill, what do you see?
It says 41.
Okay, now if you,
Oh, then I see some names to the right. My window got bigger.
right, and then
You can
there
pop
should
that
be,
window out too.
and you can pop it out, and there's two pieces of it, panelists and attendees.
Panelists and attendees. Ah,
Okay.
oh, make my window even bigger. Let's
Now,
see if there's anybody I know. Oh, there's Larry's wife, Colleen.
thank you for coming, Colleen. So the other thing we learned is because this is webinar and not meeting, I don't know that the attendees can see one another's names. Harvey wants us to know that he's wearing the original project shirt from Larry's Mac app project but nobody can see him. Well, this is what Instagram is for. You can send me, Harvey, send me the image and I'll put it up.
Hey, Nancy, I don't know if you saw, but I did manage to get in.
Okay. Where are you? Oh,
That was Tim.
there's Tim. Hello, Tim. You got in.
It
And,
is-
and so that link, the panelist link with the token worked for you. I did.
Yeah.
I didn't have to move you around. Okay, we're getting real close. I'm glad to see. Who are the panelists? We're going to introduce you to all of them. And yes, it's true, Romano Rao, we can't, because this is a webinar rather than a meeting, we can't, the attendees don't see one another's names, but we can see your names.
We know who you are.
Well, many of us know who many of you are. And all the linguists among you would be happy for all the problems with quantification there. Hi, Jock. Hi, Polly.
Just the cunning linguists.
Ooh.
And the master debaters. Bill, you're more reflective than you used to be.
Thank you.
I'm going to make sure I'm prepared with one more piece. Let me just make sure I'm in there.
I think that applies to a lot of us, Alan.
Nancy,
Muted,
this is,
Alan.
Yes.
Yes,
Nancy,
our,
this is Steve. So now that everything is working through YouTube, I'll just continue to monitor as host. If you need something urgently, text me because I may not be looking at the screen. So
Okay.
I'll be back at 7:30.
Okay, that's 2 minutes. Good.
Okay.
Thank you. Hold on one second. I'm going to make sure I have our video contributions all lined up before we get too far. That's the one I'm looking for. And here, and here, and there. Good. Okay. So that'll all be ready for whenever we decide we want to do it.
Oh, it says live on YouTube recording.
Yeah. Pretty fun, huh?
Good. Then people that miss it will get to see it later.
40 seconds.
40 seconds. Okay.
We have that network clock.
You have a network clock. Thank you, Bruce. I knew somebody would have a network clock.
They're all over.
Dorothy Bender is complaining, why is it all men here? And I think that we can talk about that as part of the culture of the mid-century and later until various people made noise.
You look more like a female.
I look like a female, but I'm a host. See, I was not a peer of Larry's at any one of these places. However, we do have a contribution from Pauline Strayland from Belgium. And so we're going to hear from her later on.
and you could have invited Adele Goldberg
Yeah.
and Diana Mary, who are both in my group.
Yeah.
And Alan also, the other Alan also suggested inviting, tell me her name again. Who was that stage cast? Alan Seifer? No?
Oh,
You're on mute.
that's an inviting Fidelia Kwong.
Right, okay.
Yes.
And should we have invited Anita Bigelow? I mean, I'm sure that we could have invited about 20 more people who would have been delighted to participate. Several of them are in the audience, but there was a limit. So I appreciate everybody who made it here today and was able to coordinate their schedules with BayCHI's schedule. And people are greeting Ron Lichty in the chat. How fun. Hi, Ron. Maybe we'll hear from him later too. He was on the Finder team very early. So,
Okay, 7:31.
okay, I think we can start. That's good. Monthly program team. I'm just trying to figure out whether I'm going to hide non-video participants. There we go. Beautiful. Welcome to BayCHI. I should have one of those clappers, right? Welcome to BayCHI's monthly meeting. We've been doing this since September of 1989 with only 2 misses in there. One was September 11th, 2001, which you may recall was a Tuesday. And the second was the March of this year when we were all surprised and shocked and hadn't quite gotten into the mode of coronavirus. And now we are. Tonight we are gathered to remember Larry Tesler. But before we start, I want to just do the usual BayCHI waves. And this is also a great chance for the attendees to use your signaling to us. I think there should be a way for you to raise your hands or one of those things, unless I didn't allow it. Well, we'll see. Is there a way for you to raise hands? Yes, I see raised hands. Great. Everybody who's been at has never been at a BayCHI meeting before, please raise a hand. Ooh, whole bunches of them. Wow. Okay. And those of you, now you can put your hand down. That was great. Thank you. And people who are BayCHI regulars, raise your hands. That would be me. Oh, there's a few of them in there. I know. Anyway, great. We're happy to see you. I think this is an overwhelmingly new to BayCHI crew. And so we will be delighted to talk to all of you and welcome some of the progenitors of UX when it used to be other things, just like figuring out what the code should do so people like it and can use it. I'm going to turn the floor over to John Markoff, and I'm going to continue to monitor the chat and the Q&A so that when we get to that part, we can do it. And John, welcome to BayCHI.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Welcome, everybody. We're here to explore and celebrate Larry's work and his life. And we have a remarkable and wonderful panel tonight. And before we get going, I just want to briefly open the evening by saying a few things about Larry's early years that might not get mentioned in terms of the people who are here who work with Larry. He was born in the Bronx, and he attended Bronx Science High School, where he actually overlapped with Stokely Carmichael, and remembers sitting in the cafeteria with Stokely, the school cafeteria. His introduction to computing came when one of his teachers gave him a programmer's manual for the IBM 650. He got that after he had figured out a new way to generate prime numbers, and that was I guess a special gift. He came to Stanford for college, and he had early access to a computer called the Link, which is arguably either the first or one of the first true personal computers. It was designed by a man by the name of Wesley Clark. And while he was at Stanford, he used it to work with Joshua Lederberg, and he was a student programmer helping design an early AI program called Dendril. Early on, he learned about Doug Engelbart's system called the NLS, online system. And so it gave him a real early sense of where computing was going, but he also very early on split with Doug on the issue of complexity. Engelbart, of course, had argued that because you take 3 years to learn a language and maybe a decade to learn mathematics, that it was reasonable to expect them to want to spend a half a year to learn a computer system. And that idea just made Larry furious. He believed that the average person should be able to quickly become proficient with a computer system. And of course, he ultimately brought his passion for simplicity to Apple. I also wanted to just briefly say that Larry was also active in the anti-war movement when he was in college and afterwards. And he was active in an alternative school in the Bay Area called the Mid-Peninsula Free University, where he and a man by the name of Jim Warren, who would become the organizer of the West Coast Computer Fair, produced the catalog of the classes in a storefront on El Camino that was just off of Santa Cruz Avenue in Menlo Park. And Jim has a clear memory of Larry telling him, as they were pasting up the catalog with glue and scissors, that someday the layout of the catalog would be done with a mouse and a computer screen. At the Free U, Larry taught a class titled, in 1968, titled How to End the IBM Monopoly. And he also taught another class with Dorothy Bender, just for people who are born under the sign of Taurus. And so I decided to check, and when I Googled it, it says that Taurus men are well known for their simplicity. It didn't say anything about whether Taurus men were well known for user interfaces, but 50-50 is not bad. So with that, I want to introduce our first panelist. I think we're going to proceed tonight sort of by when people began working with Larry. And so why don't we start with Alan Kay, who I think met Larry at the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, where they both worked in the late 1960s. Alan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, although I believe that Bruce met Larry first
Okay.
because Bruce was there when I was still in grad school at Utah and visiting to see if that would be a great place to go for a postdoc. So I would like to defer to Bruce,
Okay.
because Bruce loves time, and so do I.
Well, I believe I met Larry in January of 1969 at a Free U meeting on a Wednesday night down on the campus. So, and then we were ended up in the AI lab after that, before I was at Slack in '68. But Larry had been at the Free U for some time, and he was tired. So my first story, one of three, is Larry was the treasurer of the Mid-Peninsula Free University, and I was a brand new enthusiast, and I went to the meeting and got drafted to be treasurer. And Larry was going to be the co-treasurer to keep track of me. And Larry at that time, this picture's been on my website for some time, and he had more hair, but it was all in a huge ball, sort of an afro, and he had a beard to match, vivid red, and so he just looked like a fur ball as opposed to the long blonde look. 69, I handed back to Alan Kay, who of course graduated the AI lab rapidly. Les Ernest said that you had a hard time at the lab.
Well, you know, it was exotic.
But you went to a better place in some sense.
up in the sky.
No, the park.
Yes, I know.
You were downhill. We looked down.
Actually, I have to, you know, as long as we're doing old, the best part of this, because we wanted Larry to live forever, so the best part of this evening is seeing people we haven't seen for a long time, including you. So I should just say that Bruce Baumgart wrote one of the most beautiful theses ever done at Stanford, and I was privileged to be a reader of that thesis. And the readers of that thesis had to read it because he would put little notes to us inside the thesis, and he had actually modified the text formatting and done an enormous number of things in order to make this thesis truly beautiful to look at, as well as in content. So I
did the fonts myself. I did the formatting myself. I did not use Larry's pub.
I know. I actually have that online. I live in London now, so it's like 3:30 in the morning for me. But I still take that out occasionally just to stroke it.
Yes, well, it's all on the SailDart website.
It is.
Yes.
So anyway, that picture that Bruce showed is exactly my image of Larry, except from the rear, because the first time I saw him was noticing somebody typing furiously with two fingers. He could type like 120 words a minute, but just with two fingers, sitting at one of the III displays at Sale there. And I was just wondering, wow, that's interesting. And of course, I met him. In those days, he was working around Ken Colby and Roger Schenck, and did one of the parsers for still one of the truly most interesting little bot systems ever done, which was called Parry. And I soon met Larry and found that he was just one of these great wide spectrum, a real computer scientist. He wasn't just a great programmer. And there was pretty much nothing in computing that he wasn't happy to talk about, didn't have good ideas about. And he had some friends around. Two people he especially worked with were Horace Ania and David Canfield Smith, one of the many Dave Smiths in our field. And the best part of the AI project there were the individual people to talk to. So I'll leave my little stint here. I'll probably have to leave after the next one because it's 3:30 in the morning and I'm feeling it, even though I'm an early riser.
Okie doke. Bruce, did you have more stories you want to tell before we move on?
Well, just yes, since I guess the window of when I really was close to Larry was the AI lab, and he went at Lisp. So the next story is in those days, Hans Moravec and I and others in the Colby group argued about artificial intelligence, and Hans and I were extreme physical reality. I had done virtual reality with Ivan Sutherland as an undergrad at Harvard. And Moravec and I sort of were into what is now known as the matrix, and really believe, and the singularity. We believe that we would have AI in a few years and added to our brains, and you could go and replace a brain atom by atom. Now, the interesting thing is that Tesler was the only intelligent psychologist who defended the humanistic view of psychology and consciousness and AI. And so that discussion went on for some distance, and that's documented in one of Moravec's books, his first book, the Mind Children book, at the end. Baumgart and Tesler were opposite poles.
Okay,
But
so I should follow on to that and carry Larry into PARC, I believe, just looking at the timeline here. So one of the things that Larry and Horace and Dave Canfield Smith had been doing was something that was supposed to be part of Lisp. There was a thing that never really quite happened called Lisp 2, which was Lisp in a kind of an algolic form. But in fact, there were two of those done at Sale, one by Tony Hearn for Reduce and one called MLisp that
I just went over it recently on my archive. There were quite a few. There was the MLisp. There was Larry was working on a thing known as Lisp 70.
That was just my next story.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad that.
Yeah. Look, we're too old to keep each other honest anymore because we can't remember that well. But
No, I
It's
remember.
good to hear it from both sides. We want to hear both versions.
No, I've got all the backup tapes, Alan.
yeah, good.
And
Well,
most of it's online, and Larry's areas are online. I also have the another story is computers were very expensive back then. So the accounting was extremely exquisite and accurate. So we have exactly when Larry logged in and logged out for each day, how hard he was working, what area he was working on. So in the early years, he was working on Lisp, and then later it was Pub, and then he logged out on the last time in March 1975.
so I'll have to ask you to suppress mine because I was such a slacker. I just spent all my time thinking when I was there.
Actually, the tapes only begin in 72, and you were already.
Thank God. Okay, so as I said about Bruce's thesis, I was very attracted to graceful things done in computing. And the part of Lisp 70 that was called the Lisp 70 pattern matcher was truly a graceful piece of work by those three guys, and I helped them with a couple of things in it. But they wrote a very nice paper for people who are interested in looking at it that gives a sense of a translator that you can use at each level of translation, readable at every level. And it's just a gem of a little paper. And that being involved in that and helping with a couple of ideas helped greatly at Xerox PARC when I went there. And Xerox PARC is too complicated to talk about just because it had a wonderful set of personalities. But we eventually were able to get Larry there through hook or by crook, actually. And he wound up working in Bill English's group. And Bill English was the co-inventor of the mouse who had worked part of the schism in the Engelbart group about whether the next system should be done in a distributed form or should be another big time sharing system. That was part of the thing. And so the people who liked the distributed idea wound up coming to PARC, which benefited us greatly. But, and Tim Mott will say something about the PARC era with Larry as well. So the way PARC worked is in most cases, there weren't really research groups, although some people had more of a budget for head count than others. But generally, people who were interested in different things could float around and do interesting things. And so Larry did quite a bit with my little group there, including several of the early user interfaces for using Smalltalk, one of which called Mini Mouse, I thought was particularly fine in the very earliest days. It was just really simple and it was really powerful, and it had these things that I associate with the way Larry liked to think about things. And with that, I think maybe I'll turn it over to maybe back to John Markoff, but maybe Tim Mott.
That's great. And I'm going to introduce Tim in a second, but I just wanted to mention, because one of the audience members brought it up, one of the Stanford programming projects that I didn't mention that Larry did was that he created a program to program the flashcard tricks at Stanford Stadium while he was a student, which was a very impressive early use of his
program. So it'd be one of the earliest examples you could cite of doing bitmap graphics.
Yes, and there's a YouTube of that I watched this afternoon.
Of the original Stanford card tricks?
Yes. You go to Larry's site. Larry's site is all there.
Okay.
Which
is nomodes.com.
Yes, or you can link to Larry. Tesler's name appears on the top page of the Sale Dart. Look at the Q&A answers. We're not responding or reading them terribly rapidly here.
Yeah, we'll keep track of them. Let me introduce Tim Mott now. Next.
Hold on 1 second. I want to just mention that Barry Haynes has been dropping questions and comments in the Q&A, and we might want to. And he asked how come there were only 9 people on the screen, but of course there are 103, or it goes up and down 105 people on the listening side, and we'll be calling on you more in the future. Barry says, I remember how Larry typed too. He always corrected my spelling and punctuation errors in memos.
By the way, we should not lose the opportunity to point out the irony of having the computer-human interface group be on a rather badly designed user interface for what we're doing here, as are so many of the interfaces, especially in the web today.
Yes, and my co-program chair, Ted Selker, would be happy to tell you about the conferencing system.
I'm hoping we'll hear from Bill. Bill was one of the great user interface designers at Apple.
We'll get to the Apple folks.
Many different kinds of things, and I hope we'll hear from Bill on. And also, Bill had a real feeling for simplicity and grace, and I'm sure he still does. So this simplicity and grace, while still being able to play the violin, I think is the key problem in user interface. Because if you take away the violin to make it easy, this is the argument I had with Engelbart, and with almost all user interface, is that the simplicity part is the entry road. But if it's simple because it's stupid, then you aren't really helping anybody. And that is the problem with most user interfaces today. They've been made simple by making them not very worthwhile. Whereas a really good musical instrument has a way of getting into it. And the better you get, the better things are.
Yes, well,
The way Doug Engelbart put that, I went to visit him when I was working on the Lisa, and I visited him. He told, his online system, it took a long time to learn to use it. It was for professional knowledge workers. It was okay if it took a little while for them to learn to use it. He says, as you're trying to make things simple, we called it loser-friendly or user-friendly. And as you're trying to make things simple for the beginner, beware of making them not powerful for the experienced user. And so he said, here's an example. A bicycle isn't really an easy tool to learn to use, but it's worth the investment because it really will help you get from point A to point B. It's worth investing in learning to use a bicycle. And so he said, try to find ways where you can provide an entry for a beginner, but not slow down a experienced user. And that night I added the command keys to the pull-down menus.
Yeah.
That's great. Wait, let's try to stay in order a little bit and give everybody a chance before we just disappear into conversation. Next, why don't we give the floor to Tim Mott, who worked with Larry at PARC and who later was the co-founder of Electronic Arts, Macromedia, and Audible. Tim, the floor is yours.
You're really going to try and manage this group, John?
No.
Good luck. So fast forward a few years from the time that Alan and Bruce have been talking about. I met Larry, I think it was, in fact, I know it was 1974. It was September 1974. And somehow PARC had gotten committed to developing what at the time we called a page layout system for a publishing company that Xerox owned. And that project was sort of meandering along, as you might expect a sort of semi-production project to meander along in a research center. And the publishing company hired me to try and make some sense out of that. And it was not unlike your task here, John, tonight in terms of riding herd over a bunch of cats. But anyway, Larry, that publishing company was based in Boston. Larry came out to Boston and interviewed me. And I mean, quite honestly, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was kind of like the new kid on the block. I came out to Palo Alto. I spent 2 years commuting between Boston and Palo Alto. And one of the very first things that struck me about Larry, so Larry was the designer of the system, and there was a huge, let's just say, critical debate going on inside the research center as to what infrastructure the product that subsequently became Gipsy should be based on. But Larry was responsible for the design. And I, obviously learned a lot from him with respect to what at the time we called user interface design, and has subsequently become user experience and interaction design, and a whole bunch of other names that he violently objected to. But more than anything else, what first struck me about Larry was how generous he was with his time. And as I said, I was kind of like the new kid on the block. I really, I didn't have anywhere near the experience in the ecosystem, the sort of ARPANET ecosystem. And he really introduced me to that. I remember the day he took me up to Sale And, you know, my eyes were kind of like, you know, rotating in their sockets, particularly as the robot came trundling out of the front door towards us. Just really, really patient. You know, he and I probably the closest we were in terms of working it was physical proximity. When the Alto was first made available, as before John Allenby sort of ramped up internal production. But as Alan will remember, the Altos were really in short supply. And Larry and I shared one. And we would sort of program in 10-hour shifts with some overlap. And, you know, every so often, I guess we'd sleep. You know, we often programmed together, which, you know, was a style of programming. I don't know how common it was at the time. It was something I'd never done before. Subsequently became really well known as the buddy system. But, you know, we'd kind of like look over each other's shoulder. I think it was Alan, not Bruce, who mentioned this earlier, but one of the very first things that I realized Larry and I had in common, he was better at it than I was. He was better at almost everything than I was, but I was also a two-finger typist. And maybe I couldn't do 100 words a minute, but I could probably do about 70 or 80. And so he and I would be there like this, alternate. It's actually a miracle that keyboard survived. But there was a Q&A, I don't know where it went, about Larry's sort of philosophy of UX design. Well, like I said, I can tell you, he hated the phrase UX. He hated the phrase interaction design. And to him, it was always user interface design. And he and I would have long conversations about and this really didn't get at how do you make more powerful features available, but it was, you know, our focus was very much on the sort of novice user. But we talked about two things. One was a product shouldn't need documentation. So you should just be able to walk up to a computer and start using it. And the other was we really wanted the technology to disappear, to be completely transparent. So the sensation, if you like, that someone got was that they were directly manipulating the information they were concerned with. And the keyboard disappeared and the screen disappeared. There was a reference earlier to pub. And I really do believe that one of the reasons why Larry became very almost fixated on simplicity and user interface design was a reaction to the work he'd done with pub. Because pub produced beautiful documents, but does anyone ever remember using it? How was that experience? It was really, really horrible. So yeah, he was, you know, one of the other adjectives I think about when I think about Larry is earnest. He was really earnest, and that to me is much more than just serious. I mean, he was sort of diligent, he was serious, he was committed, and he was really earnest about simplicity and about, there was a phrase at the time, actually, it was a late 60s phrase, computers for the people. You know, I remember working with him and some of the kids that Alan's group, Learning Research Group, brought in at weekends, you know, including my daughter as well as his. And, you know, Larry was genuinely interested in how people who'd never been exposed to computers or computer technology, how they could become not at one with it, but how there would be no fear, and it would be, you know, it was something, and it was one of the reasons why it was so interesting to work with kids, is because, you know, kids have no fear about lots of things. But how do you how do you design, and what are the techniques you can use to design systems such that they are completely intuitive and totally approachable? I mean, those were 2 words we use. I mean, there are a bunch of words: intuitive, approachable, transparent. Yeah, sorry, Alan, go.
So Tim, well, I think this is a good time maybe to just say that, you know, of all the people I've ever worked with, Larry was one of the greatest colleagues ever. He was just one of the best people to work with on anything, no matter what it was, wide spectrum. And I think at least I think for most of us, as we got older and we look back, what we remember is the pleasures and maybe not so much pleasures of different kinds of people that we worked with in the past, more than the technical stuff. And Larry is just one of the greatest guys to work with because he was calm. He, like you say, he was earnest. I think that is a really important part of it. But basically, he was always willing to explore anybody's ideas around him, as well as having his own ideas. He was incredibly well balanced intellectually and creatively, I think.
Yeah, so I've actually got a couple of stories I'd like to tell about Larry there, and that's a perfect segue into them in terms of him being sort of balanced and broad. You know, I think it would be easy to listen to the last, I don't know, 20 minutes and think of Larry as someone, you know, who was overly serious and didn't have a sense of humor. There was a day when I came into the office and we'd provided, you know, we'd performed all kinds of surgery on the 3-button mouse to wire the 3 buttons together and create what was essentially a 1-button mouse. And you know, that sort of wasn't enough. And you know, this was at a time, obviously, when mice were wired, they weren't wireless. And so we shared an office. I walked into the office and there were wires going from the mouse port to the root of a potted plant in the corner of the room. And Larry had become interested in the possibility for biofeedback as a way of controlling the cursor on the screen, and thought that, you know, direct biofeedback was, you know, too big a leap, but it could be mediated by a plant. So, you know, I watched that experiment for about a day. I came in the next
poke in here because John Markoff will remember that was one of the interests at SRI.
Yes.
Oh yeah. I do.
Yeah,
I remember that.
Came from SRI. SRI had a whole group that was interested in psychic communication and plant communication and everything at the time.
If I remember correctly, they even hosted Uri Geller, who was there, you know, bending spoons at Menlo Park.
Yes, exactly. Bella Ulez also.
So that was, you know, that was a mixture of sort of humor and kind of like really broad thinking. There was another day when Xerox executives came through PARC hosting a group of people from a government agency that a number of us thought PARC shouldn't be associated with. And you know, I know I'm sort of looking at the faces in front of me. So I know everyone here will remember Mad Magazine and Spy versus Spy. So Larry dressed up as the Spy versus Spy character with the hat and the raincoat and followed this group around all day. And, you know, we had pretty free reign at PARC, even with executive vice presidents from the corporation there. And, you know, people tended to treat us with kid gloves. And so Larry got to shadow this group for a better part of the day with no one saying a word about it. But everyone knew exactly what was going on. I don't know if you remember that, Alan. That was just hysterical. Anyway.
I do remember it, and you should cap the story by pointing out that a couple of years later, the first 100 machines that Xerox ever sold that were personal computers went to that very agency.
I thought we weren't allowed to talk about that.
No, we might be in trouble even now, but Xerox actually owned a whole company that was a spook company in Pasadena called Xerox Electrical Optical Systems.
Yeah.
And they did the software
Yep.
for the system.
Well, that's where the first color printer was done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And they did I remember they did a battleground management system. It was the only part of Xerox that I couldn't get into, the sort of, the backside of the building, because I wasn't a US citizen at the time.
Yeah, you had to know somebody.
I didn't have the clearance I needed. Anyway, enough. You want to move on?
Thank you, Tim. I saw in my notes from interviewing Larry that he gives you intellectual credit for DoubleClick. Is that true? Is that your invention?
Oh. This is another funny story. So Larry's famous for being opposed to modes in user interfaces. And I mentioned earlier that we'd performed all kinds of surgery on mice, and we'd wired the 3 buttons together so they would, just functionally only one button. And when we started using the 1-button mouse, we discovered there were some things that were useful about having multiple buttons, like being able to select characters and words as well as the sort of space between characters. And I had, I mean, there may have been other people involved in this discussion anyway, but I came in one morning and said to Larry, so I had this idea, why don't we try double clicking on a button and have that mean something different from a single click? And Larry said, we can't do that because that's moded. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, between the first click and the second click, you're in a mode. Okay. And I said, good point. But if you think about it cognitively rather than physically, maybe it's not a mode. And he said, well, let's try it. And so it worked. And he said, yeah, we can think about it that way. So
thank you.
Yeah, a little story about the double click and Larry's first reaction to it.
Let me next introduce Ralph Kimball. But before you start, Ralph, I just want to mention something that Bert Cummings, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because Bert Cummings wants to make sure we get this in, and I'll insert it here. If nobody mentions what a great dancer he was, I'll lose it. I'm thinking, I think seeing that, quote, gentleman nerd, unquote, dance at the Friday beer bash was, I believe, the biggest surprise in my time at Apple. The vision is burned into my brain. So that is a slide I didn't know about, Larry. Let me introduce Ralph Kimball next, who is one of the designers of the Star Workstation and also of the Metaphor graphical user interface. Ralph.
Unmute. I'll unmute you here.
There we go. Yeah, I was in the System Sciences lab in the early part of the 70s and met Larry probably around whenever he started. It must have been about 1973. And I will echo something that Tim said. We knew it was Timothy at that point. Do you still go by Timothy anymore? But
no. I think what was Pake's secretary's name, admin assistant? Gloria started calling me Timothy because she couldn't put a PhD after my name, and she said that Timothy sounded better than Tim.
Okay,
I've never been Timothy.
All right.
So one of the things that you said that I'll echo is that Larry got a lot of credibility for his plea for simplicity because of his experience with Pub. And Pub was a really complicated, full-blown programming language. And so it was this sort of shock to go completely to the other perspective with the smooth user interface. And Larry was a kind of a disciplinarian. It's kind of funny in a way because he would scold people for abbreviations and and for making things too cryptic. And so at first we said, well, who's this guy who can go around and tell all these egotistic people at PARC how to behave? But we developed a lot of, I think, respect for that perspective, because we saw it as a concept that was really worth paying some attention to. So I want to say a couple things about the Gipsy project, which was a incredibly important thing that happened early on. Tim, you and Larry took the 3 altos and this very sort of fragile little island of advanced technology out to Lexington. This would have been in the spring of '74. So let's calibrate ourselves a little bit. This is 46 years ago. And I mean, there was no internet. These were machines that had 0.03 megabytes of RAM and a 1 megabyte hard drive. You're not going to put a lot of, documents on a 1 megabyte hard drive. So that was a very audacious experiment. And it really, there were 2 themes to the experiment, which became clear as time went on. And after you guys had successfully brought the system up and trained the initial users, I went with a colleague out there and spent a week just kind of sitting and watching people. That's one thing I love to do with the end users, is just sit and kind of see what they're doing, kind of see where they're looking. And so half of the experiment was just basic computer-human interaction, sort of pick and shovel stuff. Could these ordinary people, these were not mutant techno geeks like all of us were, who are all 30 years old at, back at PARC, with nervous systems that went 100 miles an hour. These are ordinary people. And so we're all kind of holding our breaths, I think, to see, could they use a mouse? What would they think of a display? Could they understand the concept of cut and paste? And I think that was extremely successful. I mean, that whole part of the experiment was a real validation. There were some funny things that we noticed, though, and we corrected them pretty quickly, or you guys corrected them. I came a year after you had started this. I don't think that at PARC we knew anybody who wore bifocals. People didn't wear bifocals when you're 30 years old. And so we'd get there and we'd discover, middle-aged editors looking like this through the bottom of their bifocals up at the screen that was way up above them. And we say, oh my goodness, we got to fix that. And it was easy enough to fix. So we learned some things about those users, and much to our relief. But I want to say that there was another half to that whole experience. And that was an incredibly daring thing that turned out better in some ways than it deserved to turn out. And that was inserting this technology into the busy, incredibly constrained lives of working professionals. These were people who were copy editors, and they were making books basically for schools, and books are complicated things. They have text and graphics and layouts and like typeset equations in some of the books, and so the users knew what they wanted, and they told us some things, and we were sort of, our eyes were wide open, say, wow, okay, we get this, but I don't know if we can do this anytime soon, like color graphics and taking the computer home, and will this take over the whole workflow of these busy professionals? So I think we came away with a set of requirements, I would call them, and these were business requirements, which was a little outside of the wheelhouse of most of what Xerox was doing at that time. There were things that have taken 20 or 30 years to develop. Don't forget that this was all done 20 years before there was a working internet. I mean, just sort of think about some of the constraints that we had at that time. So that was a real seminal experience. In fact, then I went about 6 months after that experience. I went across the street and we started the design of the Star Workstation. Went over there with David Canfield Smith, and we spent a while working on Star. I got some stories about that later, but I'll defer them.
Thanks, Ralph. So next, let's move from Xerox to Apple. And of course, Larry was part of one of what I think of as the canonical myths of Silicon Valley. Steve's visit to PARC, which led to his recruiting Larry to come to Apple. And that takes us to Bill Atkinson, who developed the graphical user interface for the Lisa. Bill, and you're still muted, so unmute yourself.
Yeah, I met Larry when, I think as part of a demo at PARC, and then when he came to Apple, I got to work directly with him. He was sort of my manager on the Lisa team, and I was working on the quick draw graphics primitives and user interface stuff. I ended up writing the window manager and event manager and menu manager, and so I was working pretty closely with Larry. Larry had a license plate, no modes. That was his license plate. And the philosophy was old word processors or software like that, you would get into like delete mode. And now wherever you move the cursor, characters would get deleted. It was kind of a loaded weapon, a machine gun you're walking around with a hair trigger. And so what no modes meant was instead you would first select a range of text. And then you would issue a command saying delete the text or make it bold or something like that. But that the operation of selecting wasn't in a mode where you're deleting. And where we ran into a problem with this was when Rod Perkins was doing the structured graphics editing, the Lisa graph. And when you wanted to make, let's say you wanted to make an oval shape, you would stretch out a rectangle of marching ants and then choose a menu that said put an oval in it. And so you didn't get to see an oval when you were stretching it out. And I thought this was counterintuitive. And I suggested that for the creation stroke of a graphics editor, you need to have a tool in your hand. You need to be in a mode. So you have to be in a mode where you're making a rectangle or making a line or making an oval or something like that. So you have to first say, I want to make an oval. And now you can stretch out an oval, stretch out an oval. And while you were stretching it out, you see the oval. But Larry, with no modes, said that's not okay because now you're in oval mode. And I said, well, you know, that's your religion. That's your, you know, dogma that you think is correct. But let's set that aside and look at what it's like for the user. And I actually brought in a little prototype, but just put together with string and baling wire. There wasn't production code at all, and sat down one person at a time in front of it and had them choose a tool and stretch out some rectangles. I'd choose a different tool and stretch out some ovals. And that was the genesis of the tool palette as a compromise that would let you be in a mode, but at least have the mode in front of your face. You can say, oh, I'm in the rectangle making tool. One of the things that I really liked about working with Larry, the man had very little ego, certainly compared to the rest of the people on the team. I had a lot of ego back then. I'm a little less right now, but still, Larry turned on a dime. As soon as he saw, oh, this is better, I'm wrong, this is a better way, he jumped right on it. And he didn't try to defend his prior statements about it. He just said, yep, you're right, let's do it this way. So Larry really focused on what works. And to that end, I think he was one of the people that set up a half-silvered mirror, 2 rooms, and a darkened room where an investigator would watch a subject playing with our new Lisa computer. And the subjects were often maybe the spouse of an Apple employee, and not very computer savvy, but at least sort of non-disclosed. And we'd give them a task and ask them to do something and then watch and see what happened. And when people made mistakes, particularly if people made the same mistake over and over, different people made the same mistake, then we'd say, okay, it's our problem. We got to figure it out. So Larry was really insistent on making it so that whatever people tried to do had a high probability of being the right thing to get what they wanted. So that required just a lot of trial and error. One example of that is we had a place where people were supposed to edit a document, and then save it. Now, we gave them the instructions and shut the door on them. But we asked them to mutter under their breath a stream of consciousness. What are they thinking about? Because sometimes that's just as important as what they actually do. And we had one camera in the ceiling pointing down at the keyboard and mouse, and another pointing up at the display with their face reflected in it. And these were synchronized video recorders. And we'd give somebody a task, here, edit this document and save it. And they get to a certain point where clearly they're supposed to choose between do it and cancel. They look a little miffed and they hit cancel. And there goes all their work, it's gone. And we're trying to figure out, why did they do that? What's that? Where does that mistake come from? We saw that on several different people. And we crank up the volume and listen to what they're muttering. And they said, what's this dolt? I'm no dolt. So we hit cancel. So we, as designers, knew that it said D-O uppercase I-T, do it. But they were reading it as D-O lowercase L-T, dolt. And they weren't going to hit a button that said dolt on it. Now, we didn't like OK and cancel. OK is an abbreviation and not even a correct one, but it got us through the night. And so this is the kind of thing that Larry insisted on, is actual user tests of user interface to find the blind spots that we designers couldn't possibly see because we knew too much. And that's, Larry's recipe for making something user-friendly was try it on real people and shut up and watch what they do. And I think that's still the highest, strongest recommendation for anybody designing any user interface, any product, is try it on some real people who are your test market and see what happens, and shut up. Don't tell them what to do. And people are very quick to say, oh, it's my mistake. But really, something about the design led them into that mistake, particularly if several people did it. So that's one of the ways that Larry contributed a lot. He also rode herd on a family. I think there were like 12 applications that, he actually made the name application for a software program. I didn't like it because application, I thought of application like a form you fill out when you apply for something, or an application of paint, a coating of paint. Application didn't, I like software program better, right? It seemed more straightforward. But apps and application stuck, and now app is sort of the nice short name that everybody likes, an app. Well, that came from Larry Tesler. And against, I kind of fought it, but it stuck. But anyway, Larry kind of rode herd on the dozen or so apps that were coming with Elisa, and made sure that in their pull-down menus, they all sort of did things the same way. That the file menu was over here on the corner, and the items in it, as much as possible between different applications, different, a word processor and a spreadsheet and a pie chart maker. They have different functions, but those things that are in common, he wanted them to be in common, and have the menus be in the same place and the items be in the same order, so that it felt friendly. You could, if you got used to using one application, it would give you a leg up on using another application. And so that's one of the things that Larry did.
Sorry. Hey, Bill, if I could just jump in there. So a couple of things. And I think this was, it was really, really productive, and it was really humbling for both Larry and I, was even before we designed and built a system, we would actually spend time with the end users and talk to them about what it was they were trying to do, and how if they had a different set of tools. So, okay, today you've got a typewriter and whiteout and a pencil, and if in the future you had a different set of tools that look like this, you got this computer screen and you got this mouse thing and it'll move a cursor around and you got a keyboard, how can you imagine doing your work with those tools? And that's something that I feel like I carried through my entire career and time as a designer, is, Gipsy, which, arguably was the first cut and paste, really sort of intuitive product to use. We didn't just dream it up. The users told us what they wanted it to be. And, we brought and Larry in particular brought his sort of inventive nature to the problem, but it started by listening to those people, not just saying what they wanted, but how they thought about doing their work. And, that was, I think was really, really important. And the other thing is just listening to you, you just told a great story about apps and about how Larry would also go with what worked. Earlier, we talked about how he hated abbreviations.
He didn't like okay.
The app was going to work.
Well, he didn't call it app. He called it an application.
Oh, he didn't call it an app. Okay, I thought maybe he'd show.
That wasn't until the iPhone.
I like my story better. I like my story better, Bill.
Jobs called them apps.
I'd like to just echo something I've seen in a lot of the chats. Bill, thank you so much. Those were marvelous stories.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you, Bill. And we're describing a great arc here. And next, we're going to go to Steve Capps, who worked with Larry both on the Macintosh and on the Newton. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, to segue with what Bill said, I joined pretty late in the Lisa project, and it was pretty obvious if I wanted to have any impact, I had to either talk to Bill or Larry or both of them. And kind of everybody else faded away a little bit. I really didn't have that much effect on Lisa at that point, but I did try to make a tweak here and there. And then we kind of all migrated over to the Mac group, and Larry, I think, kept up with whatever he was doing with the Lisa. But then later on, what was interesting is John Scully sent him over to cancel the Newton project. And he was told to kind of scavenge what he could. And he ended up talking to us, and he ended up liking what we had and said, I think I'd like to run this. And so in a way, he kind of prevented me from leaving Apple at that point, because I don't know what I would have done if Newton got canceled. And I think that's very indicative of something that we've kind of touched on, but I think Larry, almost on the verge of being a Pollyanna about technology, he was a complete lover of technology. And he assumed that there was always going to be a technological solution to it. Any problem, he never would say, oh, that's a stupid idea. He would say, yeah, maybe. And he gave you a lot of freedom to go off and make mistakes and learn. And as Bill said, if you happen to be lucky and came up with a good idea, he would immediately glom onto it and support it and improve it usually. And that's one of the funny things. I went back and looked at all my emails that I had from my days on Newton. And I was struck by, we'd be in a conversation where he'd be saying, Scully said this, we got to talk to Sharp with this, blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, I was trying to program some Newton script. And I think you guys, the garbage collector might've been doing, X, Y, Z. And it was just always improving and always trying stuff. And Microsoft has this phrase, or at least that's where I first really got it. It was dog fooding. He really dog fooded his technology. He would use it from a programmer's perspective, from a user's perspective. And I can remember one time way late in the Newton project, he goes, look at this. I've solved this Finder problem. So he had worked on the Filer, which was Lisa's Finder. I had worked on the Mac Finder. And one of the problems you had was, one of the edicts was when you click in a window, it brought it to the front. Well, so if I was looking at this folder and I wanted to drag an icon from this folder behind it, I would click on the window behind and it would immediately bring it to the front, and I would obscure this window. And Larry, many, many years later, came up with this brilliant little idea of, don't surface this window on the down click, surface it on the up click. And it only works in the Finder, but it would enable you to, if you had a target in this window that you wanted to drag to, you could click in this window, start your drag, and it would go in there. And then at that point, you'd say, oh, there's no need to surface this window. And he was so excited about it. And it was just like one of those things. That's such a good idea. We knew it was a problem. Nobody had ever come up with it, but 4, 5, 6 years later, he had come up with a great solution. And then the last thing, Bill kind of touched on this, but I really think it goes without saying that Apple was not a great place to work if you had the slightest bit of weakness in the Jobs era. There was this concept called the bozo.
I wonder where that came from.
Everybody knows what the bozo bit is, but I will tell you if you don't, which is that you lived in fear of getting your bozo bit toggled, especially in Steve's eyes, but also in the team's eyes. And it was a very unforgiving thing to have that happen. And I realized Larry, I think because of, his personality, because of his, anti-war, I don't know what, but he didn't fall for that. And he seemed to navigate and survive without getting to that kind of, middle school backbiting that I think the rest of us did fall for. And partially this was the Steve Jobs economy, but somehow he navigated it. And I wanted to, there were so many times, and I think Michael Chow's here, so many times Michael Chow and I beat heads with him, but he never, ever once personalized it. It was always a technological solution. Oh yeah, you guys may be right, you may be wrong, but he really was very gracious, I think, in how he managed us. And I think that was a sign of, we haven't really talked about his managerial ability, but I think he was a great manager in that respect. He let us go. He let us, screw ourselves constantly, but he would let you do that, and he would back you up when he needed to. And the other thing I realized looking at this email is how much negotiation he did with the board and with Scully that he completely sheltered us from.
Yeah.
And I think that's, it's great. Yeah, he and Mike Colbert saved ARM from going out of business, and we're all using ARM processors today. And he invented cut and copy and paste, but he also made this perfect environment where you didn't have to worry about anything. And so I think his managerial skills is something we should also herald him for, because I think he was very good at that.
That's good.
Anyway.
I love working with Larry.
Thank you, Steve. I think we're going to go to Alan next, but Nancy, do we have a video first? You're muted, Nancy.
You're muted.
Unmuting. I'm unmuting. Hello. Okay. Yes. Thank you. I was searching for which version of the control I was going to use. There's 4 choices here.
User friendly.
We need Larry to fix this.
Okay. Now I think I have to, I have to share my screen to everybody so that we can see our guest, Pauline, and she'll introduce herself, I believe, and I'm going to make her full screen if I can. Talk to us, Pauline.
About a decade later,
Oops.
I ended up working with Larry again.
Sorry, wrong video. I want number 1, not number 2 or 3. Where did number 3? Sorry, 1 second, folks. This is sausage, right?
Seeing any video, we're only hearing the sound.
Yeah, I don't see any video. Oh, there.
There.
I got a picture.
Very good.
Here we go for audio.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here together, honoring Larry's life. And I really want to thank John and Nancy for putting this all together. I'm honored to be here from my lockdown in Belgium on the Dutch border. And it's nice that in spite of all the travel restrictions, we can do this event in this digital format. I want to start by telling a very short anecdote about the time that Larry and I worked together at Apple when I was a very young and inexperienced manager and asked Larry for advice. It was probably about layoffs or how to handle a difficult reorganization. And Larry's advice was very characteristic for how I know him, which is humble and kind and very human with a lot of integrity. His advice was, treat people the way that you yourself would like to be treated. So simple, and yet sometimes so difficult. It helped me a lot at that time, and it's helped me a lot since then when I faced difficult difficult situations. So the only regret that I really have is that I don't think I ever told Larry how meaningful and impactful his advice has been.
And I'm stopping.
I'm sure he's listening now.
That's great. Thank you. And now let's go to Alan Seifer, who worked with Larry at Stagecraft, but he also has worked at Apple and IBM and Microsoft. Alan.
Great, thank you. So I'm the only one on this panel who's young enough that I don't know about Pub. I met Larry. I want to talk about the first time that I met Larry, and that was in 1991. And I was giving a demo as part of the demo day in Apple's Advanced Technology Group, or ATG. And at the time, Larry was the chief scientist at Apple, and he was the head of ATG. So I was one of many people in this big room giving demos, and people would come around your desk, and I was giving a demo to a few people, and I saw that Larry Tesler was walking by. And he didn't actually slow down, but he did walk by and looked at my demo as he was walking by. And then at the end of that day, he came back and he talked to me and he told me that he liked my demo. So I started to explain it to him and he just interrupted me. And it was clear right away that he understood what I had done. He understood why I had done it and even how I had implemented it. So my first impression of Larry was his mind was so quick, like there was no point ever in my finishing any sentence that I started with. And it worked out great for me. He liked that project and recommended it. And then 6 years later, when Larry left Apple, he formed Stagecast Software. And that was a spin-off from another project I had done at Apple with David Canfield Smith, who's come up here for a few times. And actually that first demo I gave was something that I added to Bill Atkinson's HyperCard program. And the thing that we spun off was something that I had done with David Canfield Smith as part of a project that Alan Kay had started when he was an Apple fellow. So a lot of these people have come up again in this story. But Larry has been one of the most important people in my career, and have been so grateful for what he has done for me as a mentor. And as people have said, he was such an amazing manager. And I loved how Tim Mott was talking about how earnest he was, and giving the example of, I guess Steve Capps gave the example that he did something with Newton Script, by the way. So when he formed this spin-off from Apple, he did all the negotiation with the Apple lawyers. He found all of the angel investors, and he also bought the waste baskets for the office.
That's sort of soup to nuts.
Right. So the one thing that I'd have to disagree with is when Tim Mott said that Larry was patient. The fact that I could never in my entire 10 years working with him, I could never finish a sentence with him. So I just, but the rest of it is right on the mark.
Thank you, Alan. Nancy, do we have more from Pauline?
Yes, we have more from Pauline. There was a question to Capps here. Well, let me see. Did you see that one?
No, I missed it.
Mike Worth asks Capps, can you expand on the Pi triumvirate, Larry, Fee, and Gaston?
Some of those memories may be gone. Yeah, there was Gaston Bastien was a very interesting character, very un-Apple-like, I should say. Donna August, or Fee, was actually a very great manager too. She kind of managed the insanity in the throes of the Newton project. And with Larry, I'm trying to think about how much interaction actually occurred there. I think people kind of had come and gone. So maybe Mike Worth can expound upon what I'm supposed to expound.
All right, well, we can ask him to do that in a little bit, and because we're going to call on audience members.
Yeah, this is a little non sequitur at this point, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Let me show the next video from Pauline. Just a second. It's this one, and I have to share my screen again. And they don't let me expand that to full size until I share. And we're on number 2. Number 2. Let's open it up and play.
This time at Yahoo. Larry's mother lived in our neighborhood, and I would run into him every now and again. We would chat and catch up, and this is how I knew that the commute between his home in the Bay Area and his job at Amazon in Seattle was really wearing on him and Colleen. So when the VP of design position at Yahoo became vacant when Irene Au left the company, I suggested to the recruiting team that they reach out to Larry. Long story short, he ended up joining the company, and we worked together again until 2008, when we both left Yahoo. We all sign non-compete and confidentiality agreements when we change jobs. But what I want to talk about here is the extent to which Larry went to honor those agreements. One of the projects my team was working on was Yahoo Shopping. And of course, I knew not to ask him for input on features or design directions. But Larry took it quite a bit further. He also didn't want there to be any communication in a one-way kind of presentation style where I would tell him about what we were working on. And he also didn't want any details about performance reviews of people that were working on Yahoo Shopping. And while I understand that part of that was driven by potential legal consequences, I know that this level of care about not inadvertently wanting to say anything that might breach that confidentiality agreement was really driven by a deep, deep sense of integrity, something that I respect Larry greatly for.
Okay. So
about a decade later, I ended up working with Larry again, this time at Yahoo.
Sorry.
Larry's mother lived in our neighborhood, and I would run into.
Okay.
So could I add something to that?
And
I thought was pretty interesting, which is.
Now, let me see if I can get the third one to go.
Okay, can I add something right
Nancy,
now?
Second, here we go.
Give Caps a chance.
And this is the last piece that's been prepared.
After the film.
If you could wait a second.
John, am I missing something? Yes.
Yeah, Steve wanted to say something before you
I just
start.
wanted to say something that segued perfectly with that, because I worked at Xerox also. I knew stuff that Xerox, I knew a fraction of what Larry knew because he worked at PARC, which was much cooler than where I worked. But and Bill probably remembers this too, there would be times where we'd be at an obvious point in a meeting at Lisa and we'd say, well, what did Xerox do? And he would instantly say, I'm not going to say. And he had that integrity, even, he had that integrity back then where he could have easily solved the problem for us, but he sat on his hands and didn't say a word because he was honoring the either non-compete or whatever legal document was behind it. And I always remember being struck by that, it's not that important, just go ahead and say it, but I learned not to say anything because he was keeping the high road there.
Yeah. Can I say something? So when we launched the Star Workstation in 1981, and I was at McCormick Place in April of 1981, and getting ready for the giant announcement there and everything. The night before, kind of setting things up, must have been close to midnight, 2 guys walked in while I was setting up one of the demo stations, and it was Larry and Steve Jobs. And Larry had been gone for about a year from our project, although he was aware of some of the earlier work we had done on the Star Workstation. But what became clear, and I had a lot of respect for what happened then, was that it was clear that Steve didn't know really anything about Star, that he had not seen the Star user interface. He didn't have some wink wink knowledge or anything, but I can tell you, he looked at it very closely. And there, we gave him the demo.
We can all do that.
All right. Nancy, do you want to?
Oh, roll number three. Roll number three. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Share, then roll. Stop. No, cancel. Share. That's what we want to do. Yeah. And somebody said they prefer it in the small. So let's try the small version.
One of the projects my team was working on was Yahoo Shopping. And of course, I knew not to ask him for input
This is not the one
on
we want,
features
sorry.
or design directions. But Larry took it quite a bit.
I can't count between 1 and 2. There we go. Number 3.
The last episode that I want to share is from right around 2006. I'm not sure how many of you know that Larry suffered a major heart attack at that time. I was asked to step in and act as VP of design while he was being whisked off to the hospital. When he thankfully returned 2 to 3 months later, having had a quadruple bypass, there were many things to talk about. Clearly, he was happy and grateful for the work that I had done, but there were also some things he wished that I would have done differently. During our one-on-ones, which we did by walking through the Baylands close to Yahoo, we would talk about the balance between engaging in political games that were inevitably being played and that we both disliked so much, and ambition, where we both had a very high ambition level for the team and what we wanted UX at Yahoo to become, and our values, which we both cared about and felt very strongly about. At that time, we ended up in a slightly different place. This wasn't day or night, but it was definitely different, where I was willing to compromise a bit more in order to get the team and the organization further along and really reach that ambition level. And Larry was willing to give up a bit of that ambition level in order to not have to engage in the political games and stay closer to his values. And I have to say, being older now and looking back on that period, I actually would tend to agree with Larry that giving up on your values is never a good idea. But the fact that he always knew that I don't know him any different, but living by his values, is something that I respect a great deal and that I very fondly remember of Larry.
And thank you, Pauline.
And thank you so much to Pauline. Again, wonderful, wonderful stories.
That's great. So we're going to open it up to the audience, but I wanted to start by asking this group one question, because I have this great diversity of people here. And one of the things that Larry told me when I interviewed him many years ago was that he became disillusioned with artificial intelligence in 1971, which put him ahead of many people. But it's interesting to me in the context of, both Engelbart's lab and McCarthy's lab started the same year. Engelbart set out to do intelligence augmentation, IA, and McCarthy set out to do AI. And there was this duality, this conflict right at the beginning of interactive computing. And I was wondering if any of you could put Larry's work in that context. Alan first, because your hand is waving.
Well, I think the first thing is that Engelbart's original proposal, the 1962 proposal to the Air Force, that laid out most of what they actually wound up doing. They did a subset of that proposal, but it was a very clear vision. He thought about it for years before writing the thing. And one of the things that was clearly stated in many places in that proposal, that he expected to have intelligent assistants as part of the user interface of his augmentation system. So it didn't start out as anything like a schism. Part of the problem was that McCarthy didn't like Engelbart, and various people in computing didn't like McCarthy, which was a shame. He was a bit of an odd duck, but he was one of the most brilliant people like Engelbart. And so that was an unnecessary schism there. But I think the big problem was that it was pretty clear by 1971 that in order for anything like AI to wind up being a factor, that an enormous amount of knowledge was going to have to be put together in some form that programs could access and use, because it was the basic idea of if you were born in 10,000 BC with twice the IQ of Leonardo, you're not going to get very far. And up to that point, AI was primarily processing intensive, but very little knowledge was being used. So the other thing, because Larry and I had these discussions a lot when he was working with our group at PARC, and the basic idea was that what was great about AI was not trying to do AI, but that the tools for trying to do AI were much better and much more comprehensive and more looking into the future than anything that was being done for standard programming. And we all expected that programming languages in the 1980s would actually look more like the tools used for making AI expert systems than like standard programming languages. That did not happen, and the reasons for it are interesting, but maybe outside the scope of this. But it partly had to do with the takeover of personal computing by 8-bit and 16-bit slow microprocessors. And that caused a complete reversion back to much of the programming practice of the 60s, rather than the logical extension of, at least as we saw it at PARC, of what were called workstations. And I'll just add one more thing, because when I saw the LISA, I thought, holy shit, these guys have really done it. And I thought it was just an excellent piece of work. And one of the real shames was it was deemed by Apple that the $10,000 price that it would be sold for was going to be too much for the markets that they hoped to get into. And my argument was, I said, but this is just a car. People are spending $10,000 for cars. Make them see it as an information vehicle. This is their vehicle. It is worth $10,000. And by the way, I'd like to buy a computer today for what a car costs. I could use it, not just a couple of $1,000 that's a consumer product. And so I feel that what happened here was the original, and Bill of course knows more than I do because he was there. I was still at Atari when Lisa was being done. But when I saw Lisa, I thought, boy, these guys, they made a really good set of compromises to get the meat of the matter into a machine on a desktop early on. And I was really disappointed. In fact, when I went to Apple, I wound up not using the Mac, but I got the Lisa 7+7. I used that for years because it was such a great system in those days. So I think that was part of the deal. Is in order to do any facility, you have to match up what the larger experience is going to be. And it was just very hard to get anything like artificial intelligence in the experience it had to be to work as an environment in the 60s, 70s, and then the 80s. And by that time, it was too late.
Tim, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just to follow on to that. I think also, and some of this goes back to Larry's political involvement. I think Larry wanted to be relevant. Not that he wanted to be famous or anything, but he wanted to do work that was relevant, that was going to make a difference in some sort of foreseeable time frame. And I think there was a growing sense in the 70s that AI as something that was going to be really relevant to a mass of people was maybe a little further off than we'd previously thought. think that was one of, we've talked about this in a number of different ways in terms of, Larry being willing to change his mind on a dime when he got better information, or willing to give up the idea of modes once it was evident that a tool palette was a way of doing some more complex tasks. He was very, in a very, very sophisticated way, he was incredibly practical.
Bill and Steve, can I ask you about Larry's role in the transition from Lisa to Macintosh and the politics of those two platforms? Any thoughts?
Okay. The Lisa was a technological success, but a marketing failure. Not enough people bought them.
I thought one.
And that had a lot to do with the price. It had a lot to do with its performance. It was slow. There was a point where I think Larry saw this early and Bruce Downhill saw it early, is it wasn't the Macintosh that was not Lisa compatible. It was the Lisa that was not Macintosh compatible. It didn't matter which one came first. It mattered which one had a lot of machines out in the world that software developers were writing for. So I think Larry was one of the first to realize that even though the Lisa came first and the Mac came later, the Lisa had to adapt and become Macintosh compatible. We had to go to square pixels. We had to basically be able to run Macintosh applications. And that's when they renamed it the Mac XL, a large Macintosh. So I think, Larry saw early that it wasn't who came first that mattered. It mattered how many machines are out there, because the competitor was IBM PC, right? And there are a lot of PCs and Windows machines out there. Lisa wasn't even in the running. It was the technology that enabled the Mac, and the Mac became kind of the computer for the rest of us, the folks Lisa, if you would.
Caps, do you have any thoughts?
Going back to that conversation, the thread we had a little earlier, it wasn't a pleasant competition between, quote, the Lisa group and the Mac group.
Oh, yeah.
But Larry, in his peacenik style, I do believe was one of the few people that actually did help out with the Mac. And he would take the Mac for what it was, even though at some level he obviously knew that this was competing with his project. I don't think majority of the team felt that way, but I do think he did, and I think he, supported us as much as he could from his position.
Should we mention Jeff Raskin?
Well, I think we have the ability to bring in audience members. Can you pull that off?
Yes, I'm going to turn on Daniel Lewin's. Let me find you, Dan. Just a second. Daniel Lewin's audio. You're allowed to talk, so you can unmute yourself.
Well, I thought this is what fun, and thank you all for these comments. I just wanted to reflect briefly that on my first day at Apple, I was one of those people in that room with Larry and probably Bill on the other side, looking in, playing with a drawing program on the Lisa prototype, which I guess was Lucy at the time, just the hardware and maybe Smalltalk or something. And in the end, I got to run the sneak preview program whereby the Fortune 500 executives, CEOs, and officers actually put their hands on the machine and played with them in real time, and witnessed about 90 corporations sending people through doing that all around the design center that you wonderful people built. And it was an eye-opener for me and all of the learning that I could have ever asked for. So thank you all for what you've done and what you've said about Larry today, because it's made my interest, and now at the Computer History Museum, I couldn't be happier for watching this set of stories. So thank you all for that.
Thank you, Daniel. Nancy, was there someone else that you wanted to?
Well, now I think is a great time. We've got some hands raised. So Harvey Alcabas wants to talk. And Harvey, you can unmute yourself.
I didn't actually think that I raised my hand. Maybe I did earlier when you were asking for hand raised, but I just will echo a lot of the thoughts. I was on the LISA team and development tools team for Mac, working closely with Larry on a lot of the object-oriented programming projects. And while this group, BayCHI is focused on the user experience things that Larry did, he also really was a champion for taking object-oriented programming, which people thought of as a obscure research tool, because clearly if it was used for Smalltalk and Smalltalk was slow, then people assumed that object-oriented programming was slow. And Larry assured them that no, that was not how logic worked, and that you could create practical solutions. So he led the team that did the LISA toolkit application framework. And then when Steve Jobs told him, right idea, wrong computer, do it for the Mac, Larry went and met with Nicholas Wirth to redesign the Pascal from Clascal into Object Pascal, and then lead the team doing the LISA toolkit, the Mac app, the Macintosh application framework. So he was a leader in a whole lot of dimensions, and he was a great manager and a wonderful person to work with.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harvey.
Bill, before we
I think he also did something with HyperCard. He told me I once talked to someone who said all the different categories of software have already been created. There are no new categories. And so he said, well, if I show you one, will you believe that there are others yet to be invented? And then he showed the person HyperCard, and that person said, okay, I'll go look for another one. Larry took the HyperTalk language, which was sort of captive within HyperCard, and brought it out to be this uber language, AppleScript, that could control. I use it now to control Photoshop and to control, many different applications. I think Larry was very much involved in taking, the scripting part of HyperCard and making it more system level, where it could control other applications as subroutines. And I always thought it was great of him to see that bigger picture, that you really needed scripting to be across all the different applications.
Nancy, does Barry Haynes want to speak?
Barry, I'm going to unmute you.
Right?
You're on.
Okay. Yeah, I love that time period in the 80s. I worked at Apple from 1980 to 1990. And I worked on the LISA, and I worked on Mac app and a bunch of things. And looking back on that time period of the 80s, I mean, it was a really interesting time. And I sort of felt like, I tried to be friends with everybody on the different teams, but like the Mac and the LISA teams were pretty competitive. In fact, I think it was a $10,000 bet of who would ship first. And the LISA actually won, and we had a big party. But I sort of think, looking back on that time period, if the LISA team and the Mac team and a couple of other projects would have worked together more, maybe Apple would have become the large successful company that it is now much earlier. Because Apple had so many great ideas back then, but there were also a lot of large egos, and I don't know that people work together enough. I mean, Bill, you were great at connecting with everybody. And, you know, Apple wouldn't have been Apple without the things that you did. But I wonder if some of the other people could have worked together more, if that would have helped, you know.
I don't think it would. I think it would have made the Macintosh more compromised. When we designed the Lisa, we were designing for an office worker and we're trying not to offend them. We couldn't put flies on the trash can because it would offend somebody in the office. Lisa had a little Macintosh team, had a little more playful attitude and was deliberately kept small. They said, we're going to be 10 software people. And if we want somebody new, we have to choose who to vote off the island. And that actually happened. Having software done by committee design, where a whole bunch of people are giving their ideas, doesn't really work. Steve Jobs said, one person can paint a portrait. 100 people can paint a fence, but you can't have 100 people paint a portrait that has integrity. And so what Steve's job is to erect a vision with clarity, send a flag up a flagpole and see who salutes that flag. And if somebody wants to work on something different than that flag, they should work on a different project. A small team of designers who are focused on exactly that one thing can paint a portrait that has integrity. I don't think if we put 100 people on the Lisa software team, on the Macintosh software team, I don't think we would have got as good a product as we did. I think keeping it small was part of what made Macintosh have heart and integrity. So I disagree. Having the two teams kept separate, it was horrible that there's political fighting. And at some point, Steve Jobs came into the Lisa team and said, you guys have failed. You're all B players. That was terrible stuff. But in terms of merging the two groups into one big one, that would have made Macintosh worse. I'm sure.
Well, I think I agree with you that merging the two teams wouldn't have worked, but some better way. I mean, you were one of the people that would go to both sides and talk to people and share ideas, you know, which was great. But I think, you know, like the Lisa operating system was too sophisticated for the speed of the processor at the time. And I think, you know, when Apple eventually bought out Steve Jobs, you know, he had developed a better operating system, which really was part of the reason that Apple, you know, the Macintosh was able to go forward, because what was OS 10, was that the operating system that Apple got from when they purchased Steve's? Yeah, I mean, that was, you know, studying computer science, that was a real operating system that did hardware protected memory and all that good stuff. Yeah, it was a sort of a combination. I just, you know, was early at Apple and I knew everybody, and I just sometimes wish that people could have worked together a bit more. But I agree, having, you know, design by committee doesn't work. You know.
So I just think the small team really worked, and wouldn't have worked if we'd had a lot more people on the Mac team.
So we're now at 9:10 and we're going to let this go for long, but I wanted to ask, so there's one more question for the audience that I thought would be a nice way to pull this together. And, you know, if I was still in San Francisco, I'd be walking down the street and I'd be watching everybody looking at the palm of their hand. And I don't think any of us thought that that's where user interface would end up. Does anybody want to speculate on where we might go after, you know, the iPhone interface? Does anybody have any bets? Bill first.
The more mobile we go, the more we go toward an interaction of voice and agents. Instead of looking at a screen when you're driving, it's better to talk to something. If our agents that we were talking with actually understood natural language and really understood the conversation, it would be like having an assistant sitting next to you in the car. So as you're walking around, the more mobile, the less you want to be based on screen and pointing, and the more you want to be in a conversational interface. That's my opinion.
Did Knowledge Navigator get it right?
A few things.
Anybody else want to chime in?
Well, I don't like to think what would Larry think the next thing would be.
Well, I don't know what I don't know about what Larry would think, but I really echo really want to echo what Bill said. And 5 years ago, I wouldn't give voice the time of day. I just didn't get it. I didn't think it would make any sense. And as my use of the technology has become more mobile, it's absolutely what I want to be able to do. And that metaphor of having an intelligent assistant right next to you that you can talk to, I think is a really good one, Bill. So, and I think Larry would embrace that.
All right, so then we have to call it Mary Reagan.
I think of it as Jane in the Ender series. In Ender's game, Ender had a little crystal in his ear that and it connected to his assistant, Jane. She heard everything he heard and whispered in his ear by wiggling his eardrum. So that was, an early representation of an intelligent assistant that's always in communication, always in touch.
You should just go further with brain implant and
Alan, you're next.
Okay, so if you just look historically, the Romans had Greek slaves who did a lot of their thinking for them. So this is not a new idea. And Mumford wrote a book called Techniques in Civilization, and he pointed out that as far as we can go back historically, people have made machines using humans as component parts, and cities were one of them. So basically the idea is communication, synergy, using intelligent agents, organizing them, and so forth. So this is not a new idea. It's not even, it's been thought about by people who think about things for a long, long time. However, civilization, as we think of it, is most highly correlated with writing and reading, not with having intelligent agents. And the key part of it is what happens to you when you wind up using this very difficult to learn thing. There's nothing user-friendly about learning how to read. And in fact, as McLuhan pointed out, that is the whole point of it. The whole point of it is that you become something different between your ears and the kind of thinking you can do between. So the key idea here from this point of view is what we should be interested in is augmenting what's between our ears before we worry about the external tools. And if we use external tools, we have to think about what they're doing to us internally. And so there we have a completely different vision of the future of user interface and computing, which is something that may start out easy to learn. It is easy to pick up a violin, but pretty much everything thereafter is something that requires a lot of coaching. The payoff is down the road. It's like going to school. It's like learning mathematics and science. There's nothing user-friendly about these because the whole point of it is to change the user. And so if you look at this larger picture of things, what you want to do is go back, as Bill pointed out, Engelbart used to show a picture of an augmented tricycle of a guy in racing costume and all streamlined everything, but it's still a tricycle. The optimization of the tricycle never gets you to a bike. What you need to do is you start off with the bike and then you figure out how to learn this harder to learn thing. And that's what's gotten submerged in the commercialization of this stuff. And so I think the next desirable future, maybe not one that's going to happen, but the next desirable future has to do with something that goes back to something that is really difficult to learn. And let me vote for, during my time at Apple, by far the best thing that was done at Apple while I was there was HyperCard. It was absolutely kicked ass. And Bill will remember coming to me in tears, right, Bill? Remember that? You were going to quit. And I was friends with Scully, and we went to Scully and got Scully to see what it was, and Scully became the champion of it. And that was good for HyperCard, but it was in that moment I realized that Apple was doomed. Because any company that requires the CEO to become a champion for something that is really good means that it has no corporate process left to deal with ideas. And so Scully did get behind it, and they did one of the great jobs of all time of packaging HyperCard. It's like 100 people for what, like 18 months or something, some incredible thing. And when it went out there, it became the most successful thing ever done for end users that embody what computing is supposed to be about. Larry was a big champion of HyperCard also, and he was one of the world's great HyperTalk programmers. I remember when it first started working, and to me, HyperCard was the thing that needed to become the basis of the web browser when the web happened. It was the thing right there that was symmetric authoring and consumption, and Apple could not see it. So my vote for what was wrong with Apple was the Apple board.
Well, they didn't know what they had with HyperCard.
Well, no, I mean,
they said
the Apple board.
HyperCard, but what is it? That was Apple's marketing.
No,
when Jobs came back, he kicked it out because it had Scully stink on it.
Yeah. Look,
I never told John Scully that HyperCard was inspired by an LSD journey in 1985.
There you go, John.
Well, that's story written down somewhere, Bill.
But
yeah, I've written that down. It's on my Facebook page.
Okay. I think the important message here is that there are futures that grow out of the present that wound up. And that is generally the way history works. But the fun thing about history is the abrupt changes that sometimes happen, like when you go from an oral society to a literate society, and then all bets are off. Everything is different. And I think we've gone way, way too far in the progress of easy to use, can do hardly anything worthwhile. And we need to start thinking about working on what's between people's ears again. And that would take us right back to the ARPA dream of Licklider in 1962 of augmenting humans. And Lick was a psychologist, and he didn't mean just by giving them external tools. He meant by changing how they thought about things, and so did Engelbart, and so did Ivan Sutherland, and so forth. So I just think it's time for a reassessment and a strong. The shame of it is we have technology that we could hardly even dream about, even those of us who believed in Moore's law in the 60s. And I'll admit to not being as interested in the near term as Larry was, because I believed Moore's law was going to pay off, and that the payoff was going to be have to match up to the exponentials that Moore's law was giving us, and that did not happen. People tried to get it to pay off too early, and then they started optimizing the tricycle that they had to do early on.
My iPad has a terabyte of storage on it.
Yeah,
Nancy.
And I use it. I use the terabyte.
We need more.
Nancy.
I just want to make one clarifying remark about what Alan just was talking about. When you were referring to the Apple board, you did not mean the chip board. You meant the
No, board of directors.
No, I meant the board of
directors. Then you started talking about hardware again, and I knew that wasn't what you meant. So for any audience that comes in the future,
well,
just this context.
Just to give you one example, I was friends because of graduate school with Jim Clark, who did Silicon Graphics. And when he didn't want to do Silicon Graphics anymore, I took Silicon Graphics to the Apple board and said, here is the next version of the Macintosh.
Yeah.
The workstations are about 6 or 7 years ahead on the Moore's Law curve.
Right.
This has a graphics processing unit in it, the first of serious ones. It has a real operating system compared to the one that the Mac had at a time. It has all of these things you should, and it has a Motorola 68000 based processor. You could run all the Mac software on it, and here's your machine that you're just going to morph into for the future of Apple. And that was one of several things that the board turned down that I brought to them. My conclusion from that discussion was that the board actually didn't believe in personal computing. They actually didn't believe in it. And a lot of what happened to Apple as it started deteriorating into the late 80s and into the 90s was because of the bad board. And this is why Steve's condition coming back was to change the board. The board was the problem there. And most people within Apple couldn't see it because they never got to interact with the board. But it was a terrible thing because, you know, even at its worst, Apple had the spirit of what personal computing should be about. It had the spirit. Microsoft never got it. Apple had it. And it wrenched my heart. I know it wrenched Bill's heart and Steve's heart and all of us who were there to have this chance at the real dream gradually deteriorate just because of bad management. That's really what happened.
I'm so grateful that Steve Jobs came back.
Yeah, the problem was he didn't come back as the same Steve. He came back trying to prove to people that he was a business person. And the way he decided to make money was to essentially exploit consumers in various ways. And he was very successful at it because he had, when Fortune magazine asked me what was Steve's secret, I said, Steve understands desire.
Mm.
And that was what he brought back, but he did not bring back Wheels for the Mind.
Yes, he brought back the iPod.
And so it was a different Apple after that. I left and went to Disney.
Steve talked about how the computer was like a bicycle for the mind. In fact,
it was a marketing message.
Right. He talked about a Scientific American study of efficiency of locomotion of different animals, and the condor whooped ass over humans, but they put in a ringer, which was a human on a bicycle, which did better than the condor. So Steve would talk about the Macintosh being a bicycle for the mind. And in the Mac software team room, we had a poster there of a wheelchair with a brain sitting on it. And we talked about wheelchairs for the mind.
I was able to ask Regis McKenna because I didn't believe that Steve came up with that all by himself. And Regis confirmed to me that that was Steve's idea. I thought it was one of the most evocative ways of talking about personal computing.
It was tremendous. And there is that beautiful cartoon.
Right.
Also, but when Steve came back to Apple, that didn't come with him.
Can anybody say anything about Larry's relationship with Steve? Any more stories?
Well, I think it was, I think basically, Steve was a force of nature, and he wasn't anything remotely like fair. So in fact, he was not really fair to his teams compared to the way he treated people from Xerox PARC, like Larry and me. That was not fair. Larry and I both benefited from that. While we were at Apple, like we could argue with Steve and get away with it. And he was very difficult to argue with for other people, and that was a real shame. So both Larry and I got along with Steve beyond our merits there. just because of the past history. You know, and I've never seen a good account of Steve yet in the, he may be impossible to capture as a biography because you kind of had to be around him to experience the extremes. He was just extreme. Every part of him was extreme. He could even be extremely generous on occasion, but he was just basically a creature of extremes. And my only wish through those years was, boy, if Steve only knew more how powerful Apple could be, because he could not feel the systems aspects of the stuff that he saw. And Apple lagged on all kinds of systems and networking and all that stuff through the 80s that could have been very different. But I think that's water over the dam now.
I think Steve learned a lot, and there's the arc of his career. Everybody focuses on the early part where it's all gods and shitheads and very polar, but actually he learned a lot when he went to Next and when he had a family. He learned to actually develop people instead of just quantize them into gods or shitheads. And so if I were to single out one biography of Steve that I think is a fairer one, it's the one Brent Schlender co-authored called Becoming Steve Jobs. I think that's a more fair picture of the whole arc of his career, and really includes the part where he was working much better with people.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think a real turning point was when the Sprocket Systems people at Lucasfilm contacted me wanting to get out. And I went up to Next and had one of those long Steve walks by the railroad tracks, explaining to him who these people were. And he and I went up to San Rafael, and I explained to him in the car going up, you know, don't fuck around with these people, Steve. They're really good. Don't be your Steveness. Nice.
I wanted to bring it back to Larry just a bit.
Hold on one second. Hold on one second. And,
okay.
And he saw who they were, and that is how Pixar happened. And Steve funded Pixar for almost 10 years before trying to have them do a product, because he understood that this was something that was not done right away. Many technologies and many different aspects of this happened. And that was a very different Steve than the one I had met back in 1979 at that demo that Bill Atkinson was also at.
I just wanted to mention that ARM came up briefly. You know, Larry was instrumental in the creation of ARM, and I don't think what people realize is how instrumental ARM was in Apple's survival at a very critical juncture. I think Apple was about to go under, and I believe it was selling its shares in ARM that allowed Apple to survive at a crucial time. I may have this story wrong, so correct me if I do, but I know that
that's
ARM
correct.
was extremely important.
ARM, of course, was done over here in the UK originally by.
You're correct, John.
Do you know anything about the history, Steve?
What was funny is, of course, in Apple style, we were designing our own processor with AT&T.
Crisp.
That was the main CPU, and Colbert came up with this I/O processor to do, you know, internet and wireless and stuff. Not that we had wireless like we have today, but we did have a wireless network in the original design of Newton. And he selected this ARM processor as the IOP, the input-output processor for the dual CPU that was really going to power Newton. And the more he got into it, he invented this thing called MIPS per watt. And he said, you know, this chip is really efficient, and we should start looking at things like that. And then so when we kind of had mitosis and had little Newton come out of big Newton, it turned out that Mike convinced us that that was probably a good enough processor for it. And this is some of the puppetry that I think Larry was so good at. Is unbeknownst to that, he went to the board, got them to cough up the $7 million, negotiated the whole deal, to help save ARM, because ARM was going under at this point, because they were tied to a computing business, and then the chip guys left from that. But anyway, to make a long story short, so they took that $7 million, I believe it was, and later on, when Apple needed money, that ARM had become the success story that's sitting in all our pockets. And they sold that for many, many, many hundreds of 100 times return. And so, of course, when Jobs would say, "Oh, Newton was such a failure. It was it cost $50 million and we got nothing," we of course would say, "No, you got $300 million from the Newton project."
Well, the ARM architecture is the predominant architecture in the world now. That's the rich irony.
And deservedly so, for if that's what you're worried about is well, at that time, we were on double A's, and we really were concerned about how many MIPS we could get to do things like handwriting recognition, for instance.
Yeah. Nancy, we're at 9:30 now. Are we?
I think we've done a fabulous job, and I want to congratulate. We're starting to lose attendance. Certainly, we've lost two panelists, one of whom has a bad connection potentially, but I think they said that's it for them. I want to thank everybody for being here and for contributing, and I want to thank all the attendees. I'm going to stop the recording in just a few minutes, just now, but we'll keep the connection open, and I will recognize more hands raised and so on. So we're not going to stop the conversation, and we'll continue to stream as far as I know. So if the folks that are on YouTube are happy, let's just stop the recording and say thanks a whole bunch. Oh, I know. I have one advertisement from BayCHI and one announcement that I neglected to make early on. And that is, we welcome all of you as members of BayCHI. It's very low cost, $20 a year. And that's what helps us pay for all these wonderful services that you're seeing right now. And we're hoping to get more of our programs that are in the can out to all of you. And it would certainly help to have more members who are active. So I could give you the URL on our website where the membership form is. Give me a minute and I'll put it in the chat, but I want to thank everybody. And if anybody who has been even peripherally involved with BayCHI over the past couple of years wants to consider being either a volunteer or an officer, we have an election coming up next month for only 3 offices: chair, vice chair, and treasurer. We're especially in need of a treasurer, as our person has done her good service and is ready to move on. So thank you all for being part of BayCHI's May 2020 program, and thank you all for helping us remember and honor Larry Tesler.
Thanks, everybody. And if people in the audience want to raise hands and anybody stays around, I think we're losing people, but any hands get raised and I'll try to respond.
So Ron Lichty's been holding on for a long time. I'm going to let him talk.
So, so you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I echo the part that all of you have talked about personal relationships with Larry. He was such a gentle, gracious, wonderful person to have a personal relationship and a personal conversation with. He always listened to you. But one of the things that none of you have mentioned is his ability as a speaker. I was new at Apple. I came to Apple in 1988, and as a manager, it was my first manager role. And Apple had an initiative to improve the skills of managers, which was somewhat unusual. And I went off to a manager conference, and Larry was one of the speakers at that managers conference, and he talked about managing the advanced technology group and how important it was to allow people to fail. and I came away with that just the stunning memory of, oh, managers get to let people fail. I mean, what an incredible message that he left with me as a brand new manager at the time. And then the second time that I want to call out of Larry as a speaker was at the Worldwide Developers Conference in probably 89 or 90. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States at the time. The Worldwide Developers Conference was at the Fairmont Hotel in San Jose. Fairmont Hotel had a ballroom that was filled with these round tables with thousands of developers sitting around. It was a football field sized room. And Larry was giving a talk, and Larry asked the audience, how many of you have thought about debugging Star Wars? Really interesting question to ask a bunch of Apple developers, because every hand in the room went up. And then he asked the follow-on question, how many of you think Star Wars can be debugged? One hand was left raised in that entire football field sized room. It was such a powerful moment for a speaker, and Larry was just a great speaker. So that two memories of Larry as a speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Mike Worth wants me to ask, and I think since Bill and Steve are still here, would like to hear any comments the panelists would like to make about Larry's view on dynamic versus static languages, e.g. Dylan, unfortunately introduced at the same time as Java. Any thoughts on static versus dynamic programming languages?
I definitely think he was more into dynamic programming. Walter's, I think, here.
Walter just left. That's too bad.
Talked at great length about this. But I mean, this goes back to a little bit of what Alan was saying is have the computer do the work. That when we went back to 8-bit processors, we ended up reverting back to assembly language, hand-coded assembly language. And so it took a giant leap backwards from where things were going in university in terms of language design. I mean, Alan was a big, huge Algol fan, if I recall. And anyway, if Walter wants to speak, he could be more intelligent.
Yeah, Walter is actually here. Walter, do you want to?
I lost him.
I see him here.
Here, I see him now. Okay, Walter, you can unmute.
I don't know what you're.
Siri thought I was talking to her.
There's the voice interface for you right there.
There's Walter.
The mouse and the voice aren't working today. Yeah, I mean, the thing I remember about Larry, well, I have one tiny story, which is just, it's nice for me, but to respond to that question, is how hard he worked on the Dylan version of Newton. Like didn't he have like injure his wrists or something working on that? Because, and that's just, I think, another example of he was so devoted to that idea of that being maybe the way that should be. He kind of put in a lot of personal time on that, even though he was also trying to run the whole project. And I think, I think if you certainly look at historically, the language he was interested in are clearly on the dynamic side. But that was the example I saw most closely.
Thank you.
I just have one tiny story, which is, I think of it because I think of Larry actually anytime I go in my basement. And Steve remembers this probably better than I do because I was it was a blur to me at the time, but I was working on Newton Script and Larry had gotten a prototype of a 2FX, a Mac 2FX, which is like a 40 megahertz 68040 or something. It was like 3 times as fast as the fastest Mac. And Larry gave it to me. And it's still in my basement because, you can't, how can I get rid of that? But just, the number of vice presidents who would get like the fanciest, shiniest prototype thing and then give it to the lowly developer that they think could make the most use out of it. It's not that many.
He was correct.
That's great.
Somebody was just commenting in the, where is it here? Harvey mentioned that Larry and Ike Nassy champion OODLs, object-oriented dynamic languages, but Ike has already left, so I'm not going to call on him.
We've forgotten Unicode. Didn't Larry have a lot to do with that too?
Really?
I don't know about that. Talk about that.
That's just my memory. I want somebody with a better memory than me to say, yeah.
Raise
I
a
think he
hand if
was
anybody in the
Apple's-
audience knows about
I
that.
think he was Apple's rep on Unicode.
Wow.
Maybe I'm wrong.
I'm not seeing it.
I'm going to towel off.
Sorry?
I'm going to leave.
Oh, thank you, Bill. We'll see you
Hey,
next
Bill,
week.
thanks.
It's
Okay.
a fabulous occasion to get together for. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. I think we're going to have to cut it off here.
Sounds
We're losing the crowd in both respects, although I will say we had at our height something around 115 people online and another 15 or 17 in the live stream. So that was great. Thank you all for coming. And next month, Ted, do you want to tell us what's happening next month? You know what's happening.
Yeah, what a great conversation. We should do this more often. It's great to be together. It's the being together that's so much fun. And next week we're gonna revisit a man who brought a lot of graphic design next month, graphic design to the computing interface. That's Aaron Marcus. And for those of you that have heard him before, he can be quite entertaining. That's what we're going to do next month. We missed the other one that we were planning on was about haptics. We'll wait for haptics till we get back together again.
In physical space so people can try things out. And do consult if you haven't been to BayCHI meetings before, look at our past monthly meetings. Many of them have been recorded and some of them are actually up there on that YouTube channel. John?
By the way, also suggest amazing speakers if you want to.
Sure.
Great.
Any closing words, John?
No, thank everybody. Thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks for hanging in there. And
Okay.
look forward to the next one.
Okay, folks, thank you. And thanks to the family who've been present through this whole conversation. We didn't call on you, but I appreciate your presence. Good night, everybody.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Well done. It felt great. Is it Zoom itself that makes sharing, have that little clumsiness to it, or is it? Oh, just when the video and